Sometimes in history, there comes along an individual who is born at the time and with the right talents to summarize the end of one epic and pave the way for the next. Such a man was the poet Dante Alighieri. In his great work, The Divine Comedy, Dante synthesized the learning of the Middle Ages and became the forerunner of the Renaissance. At the time Dante lived, the Middle Ages were just beginning to dissolve. His life spanned the troubled times when the Pope and the Emperor of Rome battled for supremacy, and in which the idea of nationalism and nations was replacing the medieval vision of one united Christendom. Although the medieval world was not united in terms of nations or rulers, it was very united culturally. Through all the Western world, only one faith, Christianity, reigned supreme. There was essentially one dogma, one philosophy, and one truly international language, Latin. Any educated person from Scotland to Sicily read the same classics in the same tongue. The common people, unfamiliar with Latin, had nothing to read. Dante was born in the year 1265, in the month of either May or June, for we know only that he was a Gemini. His birthplace was the Italian city-state of Florence. In these years, Italy was not a united country, and each city had its own government. Many of them, like Florence, were really little nations of their own. To move as much as 50 miles from one's home in any part of Europe was to be in a new and strange land, with its own legal codes, different weights and measures, and different dress, manners, and speech. The Florence of Dante's time was not yet the flourishing center of arts and knowledge it became during the Renaissance. The population of the city was about 90,000, and its geographical boundaries were much smaller than they are today. Instead of the spectacular domes and churches that tourists flock to see in modern times, the skyline of 13th century Florence was made up of 250 towers, rising from the homes of wealthy private families. The city was surrounded by walls, with gates for visitors to pass through. In many ways, Florence was ahead of other cities of its time. Streets were paved, and drainage was well provided for. But the streets were seldom clean, since most transportation was by horseback, and supplies were carried on mules and donkeys. Some areas of town were so filthy they were unapproachable. Also detracting from the city's beauty were the scores of blind and deformed beggars, many of them mutilated under the severe penal codes of medieval society. People in Florence, as in most medieval cities, were cold all winter long, since they relied mainly on the inefficient brazier, an open pan holding coals, as heat. The lower classes never washed or bathed. The upper classes bathed occasionally. In spite of all these drawbacks by modern standards, Florence was considered a comfortable and exciting place to live in the 13th century. Houses were large. There were public baths and hospitals. Dress and food were plentiful. The poor lived mostly on bread, greens, and olive oil, but the upper class enjoyed many banquets of fowl, roast meat, fish, and rare delicacies, such as roast peacock. There was a lot of gaiety and celebration in Florence, including parties, feasts, and weddings. Income for the city relied on commerce, and chiefly the wool trade. The Wool Guild was the largest of all the guilds, doling out work for 30,000 people, a third of the population. The florin, the coin of Florence, was the most respected coin in Europe. Dante deplored its evil influence in The Divine Comedy. Florence also had a system of elementary education for both boys and girls, and poetry, art, and mathematics were all taught and admired. Buildings were going up constantly, churches, monasteries, and private homes, both inside and outside the walls of the city. In the middle of all this lived Dante. He was born in a house right in the center of the city, almost under the bells of its ancient abbey. Like all Florentines, he adored his lively city and considered every other city in Italy inferior. In fact, citizens of Florence were fond of comparing their city with ancient Rome in its glory. Because of that love, the second half of Dante's life, lived in exile, was plagued by grief and bitterness. It's said that Dante's mother, Bella, had a dream while she was pregnant, foretelling of her child's greatness. In that dream, she was in a meadow, under a laurel tree, by the side of a clear spring, when she gave birth to a son. The baby fed only on the berries that fell from the tree and the waters of the spring. He grew to be a shepherd, and when he struggled to reach the leaves of that same tree, he fell and arose as a peacock. Shortly after the dream, Bella gave birth to a son, whom she named Dante, which means the giver. Dante's family was of the upper class, with roots that went back to the Romans who originally colonized Florence. As a youth, he studied poetry, painting, and music. Dante began writing his own poetry when he was still quite young, and said that by the time he was 18, he had already taught himself to master verse. His mother died when he was still a little boy, and his father died shortly before his 18th birthday. Before he died, however, he had managed to betroth Dante to a young girl named Gemma Donati, but their marriage probably wasn't celebrated until 10 years later, when he was about 22. The fact that he was betrothed and married to a girl of his family's choosing meant little in Dante's life. What meant a great deal more was his passionate and enduring love for a young woman named Beatrice Portinari. The names Dante and Beatrice are forever linked as one of the most celebrated couples of history, as those of Abelard and Heloise, Romeo and Juliet, and Cleopatra and Antony. Dante says he was first attracted to Beatrice when he was 9 years old, that he sought her company all during his youth, and by his 18th year he was profoundly and helplessly in love. When he first saw her, Beatrice was 8 years old, and was attending a feast in the home of a wealthy noble, along with many other neighbors, including the Dantes. She was gentle, more sedate and modest than most girls her age, and had the face of a little angel, delicate, pure, and winsome. Dante didn't see her again until they were teenagers, at which time he became ecstatic when she greeted him. Her angelic loveliness had not diminished, as we can tell from the description he wrote of her later. She hath the paleness of the pearl that's fit in a fair woman, so much and not more. She is as high as nature's skill can soar. Beauty is tried by her comparison. After he had been betrothed, Dante went off to fight in 2 military campaigns, but he returned still madly in love with Beatrice, unaffected by the fact that she had married someone else. His love continued until her death in 1290, when Dante was 25 years old. After that it still continued, but it had been transformed. Beatrice became Dante's romantic idol and poetic inspiration. She became almost a dream, a vision that enfolded the entire universe. Through Beatrice, he felt himself reborn. She was the symbol of all beauty and goodness. She made him a poet. Dante wrote of one of his most famous poems, Vita Nuova, or New Life, about her, and it was Beatrice who guided him through his travels in his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy. There is no evidence that Beatrice ever responded to his love, or even understood it. In fact, some of his early poems depict her as either angry, indifferent, or derisive. Dante wrote of having a premonition of Beatrice's death. After she died, while still in her 20s, he suffered a period of intense grief, in which he wrote mostly poems of mourning. Then he had a change of heart, and dedicated himself not to mourning her, but to praising her. After some months he fell in love again, with an unnamed woman he referred to as Pitying Lady, but it was not, and never could be, the love he had for Beatrice. His first sonnets for Pitying Lady revolved not around his love for her, but the conflict between his new attraction and his loyalty to Beatrice. Loyalty proved the stronger. In 1293, he wrote Vita Nuova, The New Life, his collection of 31 poems, all about Beatrice. When some time passed, Dante married his betrothed, Gemma Donati, as had been promised. The marriage was urged on him by friends and relatives who hoped to distract him from the loss of Beatrice. How Gemma fits into the life of this man who so passionately lived and wrote for another woman is something of a mystery. Not in any of his poems or writings did he ever mention her. Years later, when he went into exile, he went without her. Some accounts of the time indicate he was relieved to have the chance to part from her and that he never saw her again. Nevertheless, they had 3 and maybe 4 children together, 3 boys and a girl named Antonia, whom Dante called Beatrice, the nickname Beatrice had used. It was she who kept him company in the last years of his life when he was in exile. The idea of a man being married to one woman while devotedly in love with another was quite acceptable and common in Dante's times, when most marriages were practical arrangements made between families. Real love, which they called courtly love, was bestowed on a woman other than the wife, a woman who was often unattainable and frequently idealized. In the decade that followed Vita Nuova, Dante plunged himself into new interests, philosophy and politics. This too was an attempt to distract himself from his grief, but that doesn't mean his zeal wasn't genuine. He studied philosophy so intensively that for a time his eyesight was impaired. So deep was his love for philosophy that he nicknamed it the Noble Lady. He said of this lady, "I began to go there, where she was truly revealed, that is, to the schools of the religious, and to the disputations of students of philosophy, so that in a brief time, perhaps 30 months, I began to feel so much of her sweetness that love of her drove out and destroyed all other thought." There were 2 religious schools in Florence where Dante pursued his studies. One was the Dominican school, which centered around St. Thomas of Aquinas and Aristotle's teachings. The other was the Franciscan school, which centered on St. Augustine, St. Bernard, and other mystics. Once, during a church service, Dante was so deeply immersed in meditation that he forgot to kneel during the sacraments. His enemies immediately hurried to the bishop and demanded that Dante be punished. When called up before the bishop, Dante said, "If those who accuse me had had their eyes and minds on God, as I had, they too would have failed to notice events around them, and they most certainly would not have noticed what I was doing." In spite of his mystic fervor, this period after Beatrice's death, when he was immersing himself in philosophy and politics, was a period Dante looked back on as one of error and sin. No one can be sure exactly what those sins were, whether philosophy caused doubts about his faith, whether he became too involved in worldly matters at the cost of higher concerns, or whether he slipped into a life of dissipation and loose living. All are possible and hinted at in later writings. There's evidence he went into debt and had to borrow money, and it seems certain he had love affairs with unworthy women, for Beatrice scolds him for that in the Divine Comedy. Furthermore, a contemporary of Dante's wrote that his one great vice was lust, which tormented him even in his later years. All that is known for sure is that Dante considered the period of his late 20s and early 30s to be one of grave spiritual danger. Soon, Dante's studies extended beyond philosophy and into every province of knowledge. By the time he left Florence, he was one of the most widely read men in the world. His intelligence and expertise were so renowned that he was welcomed in any court in Italy. During his 30s, Dante became a member of various political councils in Florence. It was a dangerous time to enter politics, for the city was split by opposing factions that traded power and brutally punished their enemies. The 2 main political groups in Florence had been for many years the Guelfs and the Ghibellines. The Guelfs favored rule by the Pope. The Ghibellines favored rule by an emperor, in this case the Holy Roman Emperor. Dante was at first a Guelf, who favored papal rule. Then the Guelfs themselves split into 2 factions, called the Whites and the Blacks. Dante favored the Whites, who had become suspicious of the Pope's intentions for Florence. So suspicious were they that they eventually took on the same goals and beliefs as their former enemies, the Ghibellines. Thus, the Whites and Dante came to support the idea of a unified Italy under the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. So, politically, Dante was a champion of strong imperial power, just at a time when that power was losing much of its influence not just in Italy, but in other countries of Europe. Almost the first thing any party in Italy did when it came to power was to banish its opponents. So when the whites were in power, they banished all the blacks. While the whites ran Florence, Dante rose from city councilman to prior, a type of magistrate, and to an occasional ambassador. He became one of the ablest political leaders in the city. Although his sympathies were with the white Guelfs, Dante managed for some time to keep his politics non-partisan. But in 1302, when he was 37 years old, the blacks seized power again and began reprisals against those they believed were unsympathetic. Dante had served under the whites and had made open statements about his preference for imperial rule. He had also participated in the banishment of blacks, although he was loath to do so, particularly since it involved banishing one of his dearest friends. As a result, he was high on their list of enemies when the blacks returned to power. He was falsely accused of accepting bribes and ordered to pay a large fine within 3 days or have his property confiscated. He was also banished for 2 years and was disqualified for life from holding office. Dante made no reply to the charges and refused to appear for his hearing. Because of that, his property was confiscated. He was banished for life and condemned to be burned at the stake if he ever fell into the hands of the officers of Florence. At first, Dante joined a group of other exiled white Guelfs who planned to return to Florence by force of arms. They gained the support of other enemies of the city and launched a few battles in which they were quickly defeated. Dante, disgusted with the bickering and selfish ambitions of his comrades, left the group and never again joined in any politics. Thus began the years of Dante's exile. Although he was offered amnesty when he was 50, the terms were so humiliating he was unable to accept them. For almost 20 years he crossed northern Italy from town to town, from shore to shore, a visitor and traveler whose heart always remained in his home state. He wrote of these years, "Throughout almost all the regions into which our speech extends, I have wandered, all but begging my way, and showing against my will the wounds that fortune has dealt me, wounds for which the blame is too often imputed to him who has received them. Verily have I been a ship without sail or helm, driven to divers ports and river mouths and shores by the dry wind of grievous poverty." In the beginning, Dante tried in every way, through good conduct and good works, to win back the favor of the Florentines. He wrote several times, not only to individual citizens in the city government, but to the public as a whole, but all to no avail. There was one brief moment of hope for Dante when Henry VII became Holy Roman Emperor and entered Italy. Dante welcomed him, and summoned all Italy to welcome him as a heaven-sent Redeemer. In a private audience with the emperor, he pleaded with him to drive the blacks out of Italy, then wrote threatening letters to Florence warning of the revenge Henry was about to take. Henry did eventually lay siege to Florence, but the city was too strong, and he had to withdraw. His failure and his death soon afterwards were a bitter disappointment to Dante and sealed his fate. After he had supported a siege of their city, the Florentines' hearts were forever hardened against him. His exile, he knew, was permanent. "Bitter is the taste of another man's bread," he mourned, "and heavy the way up and down another man's stair." Once he had reconciled himself to his permanent exile, Dante regained his spirits somewhat and threw himself into his work. The long exile marked the beginning of his greatest literary output. He was partly motivated by the hope that if he could prove his worthiness by his writing, the Florentines would invite him to return. The years of exile were the years of his intense labor on his classic work, The Divine Comedy, although it had probably been started many years earlier. At first, Dante took refuge in the city of Verona, which was ruled by a lord named Congrande della Scala, who became his patron. It wasn't the easiest of relationships, but another member of the court, a man who was apparently quite ignorant and conceited, seemed to please the patron very much. He would delight Congrande with his foolishness and jests, and be rewarded by gifts of money. One day this man said to Dante, somewhat sarcastically, "How is it that I, who am so ignorant and foolish, should be so rich and favored, while you, who are so learned and wise, should be a beggar?" Dante's response was, "The reason is that you have found a lord who resembles you, and when I find one that resembles me, I shall no doubt be as rich as you are." At some point, Dante went in search of that more amenable lord, and seemed to have found him. From Verona, he moved on to the city of Ravenna, where he found a patron in Guido Novello da Polenta. Guido was a wealthy and generous man who made Dante's last refuge as comfortable as possible. In Ravenna, he was joined by his two sons, Jacopo and Pietro, and his daughter Antonia. There, a community of scholars formed around him. He was invited to give public lectures, and he was even offered a prestigious honor for his poetry, the laurel crown. He refused it, saying it would only be welcome if he could receive it in his own city of Florence. Dante was well established in Guido's court and given some important responsibilities. He was sent in the summer of 1321 on a mission to Venice, but he fell ill on the return trip and never recovered. Dante died on September 14, 1321, at the age of 56, after just having completed Paradiso, the last book of the Divine Comedy. Legend has it that Dante's spirit returned to point out to his son the hiding place of his precious manuscript. He was buried with honors in the dress of the Franciscan order, in a little chapel in Ravenna near St. Francis's Church. His burial was attended by the leading scholars and artists of the time, and the funeral oration was delivered by Guido himself. After his death, Dante's daughter Antonia joined a nunnery, taking the name Sister Beatrice. Although Dante wrote numerous poems and non-fiction works, he's best remembered for two books of poetry, the Vita Nuova, or New Life, and of course the Divine Comedy. The Vita Nuova, Dante's poetic tribute to his love Beatrice, contains some of the most beautiful sonnets ever written. The book tells the whole story of Dante's love for Beatrice, starting with his early affection when still a child, his delight when she spoke with him during the following years, his grief when she ignored him or made light of him, his devotion to her, his anguish when she died, his conflict over feeling attracted to another, and the triumph of his loyalty to Beatrice. Most of the poems are exultant praise of Beatrice, which elevate her almost to the status of the divine. My lady carries love within her eyes, all that she looks on is made pleasanter. Upon her path men turn to gaze at her. He whom she greeteth feels his heart rise, and droops his troubled visage full of sighs, and of his evil heart is then aware. Hate loves, and pride becomes a worshipper. O women, help to praise her in some wise, humbleness and the hope that hopeth well, by speech of hers into the mind are brought, and who beholds is blessed often whiles. The look she hath when she a little smile cannot be said nor holden in a thought, 'tis such a new and gracious miracle. Besides the exquisite poetry and prose of Vita Nuova, the book takes us on a tour of 13th century Florence as we're carried along with Dante on his daily tasks, meeting the large numbers of people who influenced his life. The scenes include the city streets, the passers-by, a church, a riverside, a festival, a funeral, and Dante's own room. The characters include not just Dante and Beatrice, but their relatives and friends, and the citizens of Florence. The Divine Comedy is believed to be the greatest medieval work of literature. Dante began it in 1397, when he was 42 years old, and worked on it for most of his remaining years. The word comedy wasn't used then exactly as it's used today. To Dante, it meant a song of the people, and a story that begins in conflict but ends happily. Never did Dante call it a divine comedy. His title read, "Here begins the comedy of Dante Alighieri, a Florentine by birth but not by conduct." The divine part was added 200 years later, in 1555, by an Italian editor who was overcome with the loftiness of the work. But the public liked it, and it has stuck ever since. The comedy is Dante's tale of a journey through hell, purgatory, and into heaven. But in the course of that journey, he also gives us a course on medieval thought and attitudes, so the book is valuable both as a superb work of poetry and as an historical document. Even more importantly, although Dante knew Latin well, he chose to write in his mother tongue when he composed the Divine Comedy. Dante transformed the common language of the people into the language of literature, thereby setting a standard that transcended all the many local dialects. Before, only Latin had served this purpose. After him, Italian did. Dante even wrote a pioneering study of linguistics in which he argued for the use of the vernacular, or common language, in serious works of literature, and for combining all the different Italian dialects into one new national language. Such a language, he believed, would help unite his country. This is just what he set out to do when he wrote the Divine Comedy. Dante took what he liked best from a number of dialects and built around them the language of modern Italy. The Italian Dante pioneered in his work soon became the leading literary language of Europe, and continued to be for 3 centuries. As a language, Italian has changed very little from his day to the present. He provided the instrument by which literature became accessible to the common people, not just to read, but to create. At about the same general time, the same thing was happening in Germany, France, and thanks to Chaucer, in England. After these years, Latin gradually declined until by the 1800s it was no longer the language of the scholar or artist. The Divine Comedy is a poem, partly in prose, that tells of Dante's spiritual development and focuses on the theme of life after death. It is a powerful Christian vision of the eternal destiny of humankind. Dante, and most others of his age, believed that every human being lives a finite period on earth, which is followed by an infinite life after death. If an individual is in harmony with God at the moment of his death, his spirit first spends a time in purgatory, and after that joins God in heaven. If at the moment of his death an individual is not in harmony with God, his spirit goes on to dwell in hell forever, deprived of even the sight of God. In Dante's journey through hell, purgatory, and up to heaven, he sees and talks with great men and women of the past, or people he himself has known. This, of course, gave him a perfect opportunity to exercise the biases of his age, as well as his own biases. It was he, the writer, who decided which characters to place in hell and which in heaven. That is why we find the great spiritual leader Mohammed in hell, for after all he was not a Christian, and it's why we find those who violated Dante's political and moral ideals in hell. The exiled patriot also placed treachery as the lowest circle of hell and the worst sin. The Divine Comedy is not by any standard an objective or detached view of the afterlife, but it is a very revealing picture of medieval beliefs and morals. It is the Roman poet Virgil who guides Dante to the earthly paradise. It is his love Beatrice who guides him through the 9 heavens to the empyrean, the realm in which God himself dwells. The opening lines of the comedy recall Dante's spiritual crisis. Halfway through the journey of this life, I found myself astray in a dark wood, for the right way had been lost. Ah, how hard a thing it is to tell what it was like, this wood wild and rough and dense, which even as I think of it renews my fear. When Dante and Virgil arrive at the gate of hell, it bears the famous dire inscription, Per me si va nella città dolente. Through me one goes into the woeful city. Through me one goes into eternal woe. Through me one goes among the lost souls. Justice moved my high Maker. The divine power made me, the supreme wisdom and the primal love. Before me were no things created save things eternal, and I last eternally. all hope abandon ye who enter here. Dante and Virgil pass through 9 levels, or circles of hell, each with additional levels. Spirits dwelling in these circles have all committed a particular sin, such as heresy, violence, fraud, or treachery. Dante encounters hordes of spirits, all of them varied and vivid. Some he recognizes, others tell him their stories, and often they are people we sympathize with and even admire. Some are even noble and heroic, such as Ulysses. From hell, Dante proceeds to purgatory, which he envisions as a mighty mountain leading directly from earth to heaven. Here we find the souls being purged, cleansed of their last remnants of sin, so they can ascend to heaven. Though they suffer, they are content in fire because they hope in good time to reach the company of God. At the summit of the mountain is an earthly paradise where Dante finally meets his lost love Beatrice. Even though she's covered by a white veil, Dante recognizes her. And my spirit, through a hidden virtue that emanated from her, felt the great potency of olden love. Paradise to Dante had 9 revolving spheres, all made up of pure light. Dante and Beatrice rise through each one until they arrive at the Empyrean, where God dwells, described by Dante as light of the mind filled with love, love of the true good filled with joy, joy that transcends all sweetness. One of the most remarkable points about Dante's comedy is that while most people of his time didn't have a clear concept of eternity, nor a clear concept of the joys of heaven, Dante thought it was perfectly clear. He had a personal vision of the unknowable and undefinable that was vibrant, detailed, and both human and divine. Dante belongs to the handful of greatest names in Western literature. The contributions he made to his art and to civilization are numerous. His profound understanding of medieval thought leaves us a vivid picture of that era. His mastery of technical skills, the beauty of his language, and the drama of his imagination brought poetry to a level unequaled until Shakespeare and Milton arrived. And because of Dante, Italy and its people were given a national language. Before him, the Christian world had no poet, and Italy had no voice. But most importantly, Dante reflected in his writings the aspirations and fears of his contemporaries, while also placing them in a realm that is universal and timeless. His Divine Comedy has flourished for more than 650 years. Dante ranks among the few poets born to represent an age, who have remained everlasting guides and inspirers of future ages.